Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast,
a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Hey everybody, welcome back and thank you so much for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast. Mariano Alvarez here with Brent Labrada and a special return guest we'll get into in just a second. Before we do, I want to outline what we're going to be going over and I want to give shout outs to our loyal listeners. Now, with our previous episode, we were talking about the first in a three-part series because dog trainers neglect the skills required to run a successful business, the ability to create a clear vision of what you'd like to offer, then being able to effectively communicate that vision to other people, and finally, the ability to offer effective leadership to bring that vision to fruition. These are all vital skills that are all going to require the mastery of many other skills to get off of the ground. And during our previous episode, we discussed the importance of being able to think like a leader. Today, we're going to cover the importance of being able to communicate like a leader. Communication skills are something that dog trainers can sometimes lack. They're effective with their dog training, but sometimes can be ineffective as a boss, as a coach, as a mentor. So today, we are going to go over a couple critical components. A few, actually. These are going to be the importance of listening, the importance of communicating tactfully, and of course, the importance of teaching and training. And before I kick it over to Brent, I want to give shout outs to Dina Casalini, Brian the Santa Barbara Dog Dude, and Robin Ann. We love you guys. Thank you guys so much for all your ongoing support. And with that, over to you, Brent.
Yes, thank you, man. Thanks for that. I want to thank our special guest, Tyler Muto, for coming back for a second episode. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Doing great. We really appreciate you joining us. You're all the way in Buffalo, New York. You're like 3 hours ahead of us. And it just so happens you happen to be free right when we're waking up, which is
It's
great.
my sweet spot. Yeah, it's my sweet spot. It's perfect.
Yeah, it works out awesome. So as Mariano was saying, this one we're going to be talking about how to communicate like a leader. And for those of you guys who are listening who kind of want to connect with the theme a little bit, you know, we hear it all the time as dog trainers. Sometimes people become dog trainers. They work in the animal industry because they actually don't like dealing with the conflict or the interactions or the tensions that might come with having to deal with humans, right? I actually have trainers that they opted out of doing sales and working with clients because it was just so anxious for them. I mean, you know what? If that's their choice, that's what I want them to do. But the big thing is a lot of dog trainers, you know, it's so easy to talk to people when things are going well, but it is hard to talk to people when things are going wrong. And a lot of our, I guess, mishaps may be because maybe we communicated to someone disrespectfully or inappropriately or at the wrong time in the wrong tone. Maybe we upset a client, right? Maybe we said something in a way that we didn't actually think it through and didn't mean it. So what we're going to go over today is we're going to go over just some of our basic tips on how we can communicate better. Now, whether you're a dog trainer who is looking to hire that employee, and maybe you've hired a couple of employees and, you know, maybe you wonder, like, why do they keep leaving or why don't they stick around, right? Or maybe you work for a team of trainers or with a team of trainers, or maybe you work for a company. All the things that we go over in today's podcast is gonna help kind of fill in certain gaps with some of the weaknesses common weaknesses people have when communicating with other people in the dog training business and kind of just in the world, right? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. One of the points that we have here is we're talking about the importance of listening, and this is something I wanted us to riff on, right? My experience is sometimes people don't listen and they just say what they think needs to be said because they think the sooner I say it, the faster it'll get done. But not necessarily are people listening or even paying attention to what's happening. And I remember as a business owner, you know, I would be off seeing clients for a long time. And then I would, so there'd be hours I wouldn't be at the office. And then I'd show back up to the office. And then I would see people not doing the things that I thought they're supposed to be doing at that time. And instead of asking questions and instead of watching them to see if they're in the middle of something, I would just assume they were off task. And I would say, go do this, go do that. Why are you guys sitting down? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And guess what? It provided a lot of tension. And so I wasn't listening to them and I wasn't even observing them to a point to actually get a sense of the full picture. What do you guys take from this idea? It's important to listen and it's important to observe.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think one tricky thing I think for a lot of, especially if you're the business owner or, you know, the manager per se, is it's really hard. Like I heard this quote from Seth Godin, actually, who's a well-known author, where he said, it's really hard to work in your business and on your business at the same time. And a lot of dog trainers who get to a point where they're like, I need to scale, I need to add staff. They're still very much in the day-to-day pretty full-time. And if you're side by side with the trainers, then that can work out okay. But if, like you said, you're gone on private lessons for a good chunk of the day, it's hard because you're not seeing the full picture all the time. And so it's like you can come back in, like you mentioned, Brent, and you can see stuff that's going on. And it's really it's not easy to address the errors that you see happening, but it's easy to notice them because in a sense, when you have a really constricted sort of window of time, like you kind of feel like, okay, I have to fix anything that's broken here. So one of the first things I wanted to mention that like I always personally found this challenging as a manager. I had to always remind myself, and I didn't always consistently do a very good job of it, I'll be perfectly honest, is making a very concerted effort to try to look for things to give people a pat on the back about. Like to really try to take notice where I'm not just sweeping through the building looking for any mistakes that have been made, but I'm also very mindfully sweeping through the building, if you have a building, but for me, that was what it was, looking for things that people did well. And that is something that like I said, I had to constantly give myself reminders about. But I think being a good manager or leader, it's really crucial because like you said, if you're just walking in after being gone half the day and just like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, it's going to create a really unpleasant work environment for people. And obviously that's an important piece of the job. Like we have to do those things, but we don't want to only do those things. We definitely want to make sure we're building people up as well. But that was sort of like the first thing that popped into my head when it comes to like one of the challenges that I personally faced, trying to run a successful dog training business. And that's why like once my business got to a certain point, it actually like I pulled myself out of the day-to-day. Like I stopped doing private lessons and things like that because I recognized that my business was at a scale that if I wanted to run it well, I had to actually devote my full-time attention to running it.
It's interesting. I was thinking about like again, sometimes we can cloak things in a cloak of efficiency. And I remember when I was a young kid, I worked for my uncle 3 times and he fired me. By age 16, he fired me 3 times, right? And there's a quote that he gave me, which I don't know if it's healthy, but it resonated with me during my early career. But when he fired me, it was always because I was trying to do something better. Like I was digging a ditch for a plumber. Right. And I said, well, uncle, I was trying to dig the ditch with like a 20-degree angle so that it would flow down properly. And he goes, young man, I don't pay you to think. I pay you to dig. And it's like that idea of like just do your job. I'm paying you to do your job. Right. And unfortunately, like at least on a construction crew, time is money. You know what I mean? And with some businesses, time is money. But I remember that thought resonating in my head where, I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to pay attention. Just do what I tell you to do because I'm the boss. And obviously the way I do it is the best way to do it because I'm the boss. Right. And so there's some ego in there, and there's some attitude there. And there's like, I remember that just used to get me in trouble all the time I mean, Mariano was there. You knew it, Mariano. He'd be like, shut up. Mariano always had my back, but little thoughts like that, like things that are implanted in your head really affect the way you treat people, and they can really get in the way of progress and success and connection with your staff. And as I've gotten older and failed a bunch of times with managing people, like you hear the cliche, like you think they work for you, but you work for them. And the more that you can kind of change that mind frame, the more you want to be of service to your staff, and the more you want to, for lack of a better term, you kind of raise them. Like you raise them to maybe think like you, not necessarily do what you would do. You raise them to follow your same principles. You raise them to understand what the values of the company and how you would like clients to be served, and then you kind of give them freedom to do their thing, just kind of fly on their own, and you guide them along the way. So anyways, I just was riffing on that idea. I was like, this is why I was fucked up when I was younger, is these little thoughts.
There are actually so many things about what you just said that I absolutely love, but at risk of just going on a complete tangent and digression, one thing that I think really stood out to me was when you said at service to your employees. Like as a dog training business owner, your staff is ultimately your biggest asset. They're sometimes your biggest liability and your largest source of frustration as well, but they're definitely your biggest asset. And again, I want to be very, like, I'm going to be super clear here. Like, I, throughout my career, have not always been like the top-notch, like, awesomest manager in the world. And that's why ultimately, because I'm a big fan of hiring for my own weaknesses, I put somebody else as a general manager. Right. I'm good at like knowing sort of what needs to happen from a management standpoint. I'm not always good at being mindful of and then executing on those things. And that's something I'll get into in more detail a bit later. But the one thing I wanted to say is, from a listening standpoint, I think it's always good as like a regular check-in. So not as a part of like addressing something that's happened or a problem, but to just check in and say, hey, do you have everything you need in order to like perform your job at your fullest? Because that really is, like, as the business owner or as the manager, like, our staff's job is to like do what we ask them to do to a certain extent. But our job is to make sure that we're facilitating that as much as possible, that we're making it as easy on them or easy for them to perform at their absolute best. And so that idea of like, yes, like I am the boss, and to a certain extent, like your job is also to like kind of make my life a little bit easier, because it's really hard being the boss. It's really hard owning a dog training business. Like, you know, I will put out there, if you are listening and you are an employee, like, have empathy for the person who's managing, because like the stressors that are there are unbelievable. And we want employees that are going to actively help to like alleviate some of those stressors, but that has to also be a two-way road where the manager says, cool, but I also recognize that like your job is difficult too. And my job as manager is to like, is there anything you need? Are there resources that you had that you wish you had? Is the schedule too crunched and you're feeling like you don't have the time you need to execute things properly? Like, for instance, and this is probably the last thing I'll say because I don't want to eat up too much of this, but like you mentioned about your uncle saying, like, I don't pay you to think, I pay you to dig. I totally get that in that particular line of work. I think depending on what kind of dog training business you're trying to run, but for this may or may not be true, but for me, like, that statement is absolutely not true. I want my trainers to think. I want my trainers to be independently strong. And one other thing that you said was that like you don't need to do everything exactly the way I would, but I want to kind of teach you to think or like to approach problems the way I do, even if you come up with a different solution than me. And, you know, a big piece of that sometimes is just like giving them enough room to think, where like we might only be looking at the bottom line as a manager and okay, I'm going to pack you in with like this many dogs to work and, you know, kind of pack in every part of their day. But if you want them doing like really good work, if you want them approaching dog training artistically, meaning like not just like an assembly line, but actually like creative thinking and problem solving and trying to work out what's best for each dog, they need some breathing room to do that. So that's one of the areas where we do want to listen again to our team, because sometimes time is a resource that they need more of in order to perform really well. But just in general, the idea of any, like, whether it's just your annual check-in, like my general manager, Amy, was really good about doing like, she did annual check-ins and then like a quarterly check-in to like touch back on the things that were discussed. And like, she was so good about this stuff, way back. Like, why I put her in place as manager, because she did a lot of things better than I did. But one of those things was just that, like, are there resources you need from us? Are there things that we can do to help you do your job really well? So it's not just us saying, here's what we need you to do better. It gives the employee a chance to also say, hey, I also feel somewhat limited by this, or this is a routine source of frustration in my day. Is there any solution? It's like, you know, sometimes there are just frustrations. There's like, I know that sucks. There's just like nothing I can do right now, but we want to at least give them the chance to verbalize that. And if we can come up with a solution, we absolutely want to try, because that's what's going to help to retain.
Yeah. One thing that you talking reminded me of was, you know, like they have things called like open door policy, right? Like, yeah, just, I'm your manager. I own the company. Just come and ask me anytime. And let's say you're just a team of 2 or 3, right? Yeah. Come and ask me. If you have a problem, just come and ask me. And I remember used to thinking like that was enough. It was enough to just say, hey, just come to me when you want. And then I would realize that some employees would whisper to other employees who whispered to other employees because they knew that employee would come and ask me, right? And then so I started thinking, I'm like, even though I say come and ask me, we don't have a strong enough relationship where they actually think that that's true.
Yeah, especially a newer employee may be a little bit hesitant.
Yeah. And they won't have that relationship unless I, you know, talk to them, have a rapport with them, and in essence, develop trust and rapport, right?
or if you actively set up the meeting and then ask them those questions, because again, you're the leader, right? So you've got to take that initiative.
Exactly. And sometimes you just have to pattern it like, hey, we're going to meet once a week so you can tell me what you think and what you don't think. And then little by little, they might come the courage to, in between meetings, they come and tell you what they think, you know? And it's really interesting because it's like training a habit, right? Like you might have to pattern it in the beginning, and then eventually they see the utility in it. They start doing it on their own. And I just remember that being one of my biggest frustrations is like, I'm trying to listen, but people aren't talking, right? I'm trying to pay attention, but people act different when I'm in the room. You know what I mean? And so I had to kind of create these opportunities for like ways of me collecting that information so I could actually know what's going on, not just assume what's going on. And one of the key parts was actually helping people and motivating people to like, hey, whatever you see, give me that information so that I kind of know what's happening. And it was really interesting when I saw the shift where I saw like my managers, and this is, again, I'm sharing you things that I've learned over the last 2 years, so it's pretty fresh in my brain. But when the communication became a lot better between me and employees and my ability to listen to them, when I started being more present, right? Because naturally, when I was out doing group classes and private sessions and sales and all this other stuff, and I was out of the office 85, 90% of the time, they developed their own little squad. And then when I would show up, it was like, oh, dad's home. You know what I mean? And it was kind of like the kids versus dad. But when I was there taking care of the kids more, they would come to me and ask me things, and I could be of service to them. And they actually felt that they could communicate to me the information a lot better. And I just thought that was interesting. It's like, at the end of the day, it's all relationship, you know, that's communication is an attempt to, or can be the result of relationship, you know?
Yeah. I think one thing before we get like too far into this that I sort of wanted to mention like early on too, because I work with a lot of professional trainers who are at the stage of like, they've got a decision to make. Do they want to sort of stay more like a mom and pop, right? Like maybe it's just them operating out of their home. Maybe they have like 1 or 2 assistants, or do they want to start to scale? Do they want to go in to like, do they want to, for instance, lease a property or a facility, a brick and mortar type thing, where the staffing needs are going to grow significantly? And I think one challenge that I think a lot of people don't always think about, I think I certainly didn't because I was really young when my business really took off. It is, you know, just because you're a really good dog trainer and your dog training business is going really good, like that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a good manager. And being a good manager is just as much of a skill and an art and a craft as being a dog trainer is. And so you really need to stop and think, like, before you even get to this point, like, do I care enough? Like, do I actually want to manage people? And do I care enough about doing it well before I put myself in this position? And I see it not just in the dog training world. My wife is a lawyer, and I've seen it in some of the workplaces that she's been in, where it's like somebody's a really good lawyer, so they get promoted to be a managing attorney, and now they're primarily managing other attorneys, but they've literally put no effort into educating themselves on like how to be a good manager. It's just sort of this, like a given that because I was a good lawyer, that means I'm going to be a good managing attorney. And a lot of them end up being really shitty managers. And that was certainly something I had to learn like early on. Like I didn't quite realize that. And then I had to really start to devote enough time and attention to try to be good. But then I ultimately realized like I didn't want to manage people. Like I didn't really have, I'm the kind of person personally, and not everybody's like this, but I'm either like, I either do something like 150% or I have a very hard time doing it at all. It's just the way I've always been as a kid in school, throughout, you know, hobbies. It's like either I'm like obsessed or it's like painful for me to do.
It's the ADD. It's okay.
Well, there's a lot of things, but, you know, point being, I didn't have enough desire to like be a good manager. Like I didn't really want to be a manager, and I didn't really have a lot of desire to like, again, like improving that skill takes time and attention. Like we talked about before, like in the previous episode, like journaling, self-review and reflection, this and that. I didn't have enough drive to like make that not a painful thing for me. So I ultimately decided to sort of step down and again, put somebody else in that position. My business was luckily at a size where I could afford to do that. If you only have a few employees, you probably can't afford a full-time manager. But when you can get it to a point where you can. And so that's where it's like, it is a tricky thing where I do think I've I've worked with at least a couple dog trainers over the past 12 months that found themselves in this position where they grew this really successful business, home to realize like how much their actual day-to-day role was going to change and the skills required were going to change. And they were just miserable, like financially, like making money, right? But vocationally just not doing what they want to be doing. And I think that that's really important, before you get yourself in a jam. But also, if you are here, like just recognize that all the time and attention that you've put into learning dog training technique and methodology and being a really good dog trainer, like being a really good manager honestly deserves just as much time and attention and care, and like presence, like you mentioned, Brent. And so like, don't just think that it's going to be this thing you can sort of glaze over and it's going to go well. And if you do have employees, again, they're your biggest asset. It's an extraordinarily important part of your job. So either put the energy into doing it well or do what I did and pay somebody else to do it if you're not willing to. I ultimately got to a point where I was like, this is not, like, I wasn't happy. This is not what I want to be doing. And I recognized that I wasn't putting the kind of care into it that was required. So I hired somebody else to do it, right? I elevated somebody up to do it.
I ask you to, both of you, like, what do you guys feel is the quality of a good manager? Because I'm with you. Like, I felt like I went through the management phase because I had to, but yeah, I don't want to be telling people what to do all day, but I do like supervising and helping.
Yeah,
I like seeing where I can be of support, But
and
what
that's what was great about where I got to, because I had somebody else doing like the day-to-day management, right? And then I was really like the coach at that point. So I didn't have to address problems. I didn't have to do the HR kind of stuff. It was just like, oh, you got a tough dog? Let's talk it through, and like, that's where I excelled. And that's a big part of like that's what I do now. I'm a coach, right? So I coach other dog trainers. But yeah, the actual like being a manager, which does entail like, again, sometimes you got to crack the whip. Sometimes you got to offer that support, or you got to shoulder the burden of things. It's the skill set. So yeah.
Yeah. Are there specific characteristics that you would see in a successful manager?
I think like I heard recently, I was listening to like it was like a mini course kind of thing. And it talked about like three sort of core, like mentorship style, or I should say like leadership styles or management styles. I sort of leaked a little bit of where this is going, but like the first one was like the enforcer, right? Which is, I think, kind of like what you and I spoke about, like where you're gone half the day, you come back and you feel like, okay, like I'm only here for an hour. I gotta like, what do I need to enforce? Where have you guys been slacking off because I wasn't here, kind of thing, right? The other would be like a protector, right? Like you're gonna shelter your staff from any of the stresses. You're gonna tackle everything for them. And then the third, which is really the preferable one, is like the mentor, which is really like a lot of the stuff that we already kind of talked about. But it's like, if there is a problem, like let's say somebody is underperforming and you need to talk to them, not just saying like, hey, you're underperforming, this needs to improve, but also like, okay, but like, what can I do to facilitate this improvement? What does improvement look like? What habits need to be installed? What resources do you need? And really like being a part of that process of talking through and finding that solution, which again, I think begins with listening. So it's like exactly what we're kind of talking about here, just sort of being a little bit open to that, having a high expectation for people. So unlike the protector role, where it's like, I don't think you can handle this, so I'm going to do it. Like I'm going to step in, right? Saying, no, I know you can handle this, but I'm not just going to crack the whip and like, you've got to figure it out. Like, I know you can handle it, but like, I'm going to provide support and I'm going to help you think it through. Right. And I think that sort of mentorship mentality of, again, having a high expectation, like holding people in high regard, giving them the honor of saying like, I think you're capable of being a great dog trainer. I think you're capable of being an on-time employee. I think you're capable of working really good with the other members of the team. So perhaps there's a little piece of the puzzle lacking, which is why you're struggling right now. Let's figure that out. Right. So we're honoring them. We're honoring their abilities, but we're also going to have some accountability, but we're also providing support. So it's a little bit of like bringing everything all together. And I think that's kind of the overarching quality that it really takes. But I think it, again, as a big quality, like, just like I mentioned, like last week, of like, it kind of starts with like, you got to have a goal. Like you got to recognize like what your weakness is. So like, if you're in a position of being a manager, like just recognizing like, hey, like I gotta work on this. This is a skill. Like I've spent my career making myself a good dog trainer. Now I got to start being a manager Well, like I said, all the time and attention you put into learning how to train dogs well, like be ready and willing to put that time and attention into being a good manager. That quality alone, if you're trying, I think your staff is going to recognize that you're trying, right? Have some humility, like be open and honest about your mistakes and that journey you're on. Like I would often tell my staff, like, hey, listen, like I'm not super good at this. Like this is not my strong point. So let's like bear with me here. And so I think those two things, like try to have that mentorship mentality, recognize that it's a skill set that deserves a decent amount of care and attention, and then have the humility to like, again, like you may be a great dog trainer. You're probably out of the gate, just like anybody who's new at anything, like probably not the best manager unless it's something that comes natural. Like some people it does come more natural to. For me, it doesn't. And so have that humility and just be honest about it. Like be honest about your mistakes, or be honest about when you're, hey, like I'm trying to do the right thing. I don't know what the right thing is, but like this is the decision I have to make. Like I'm doing the best I can here, and not just like, puff your chest out like you're instantly like manager of the year, because it's probably not the case.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much good stuff that I love just having these prompts and we just riff and there's all this good stuff that comes out of it. Mariano, are you anything you want to add?
I think a couple of things. I think a level of self-awareness has been a pretty common theme so far. And I say that for a couple of reasons, or rather I say that to cover yourself on both sides of the extremes. So for example, when Brent was saying that I pay you to dig, so to speak, I see the fault in both ends of that spectrum. And I'm just going to verbalize it for the audience. I don't want a mindless drone, of course. I want creative, thoughtful, intelligent, motivated employees. Anyone does. And anyone should. But at the same time, in any workplace I've ever been a part of, I've definitely met people who are too invested in doing someone else's job than their own. So there is a level of, yes, think, but also dig. Your job is to dig, right? And I mean that in the sense of, this person does this job, that person does that job, they're friends at work, and that's great. I like having friends at work. I like people enjoying going to work and seeing their friends, looking at the schedule and getting excited. But if your friend constantly needs help with their task and you keep helping them, the problem is your job's not getting done. And the problem is if they keep needing help, we don't know that they're undermanned because you keep helping them. In fact, it can get even more confusing when friend A keeps helping friend B. So friend B's job keeps getting done, even though it really looks like it's a 2-person job or a 1.5-person job. But because friend A is helping, we think friend A has too much on their plate. They're just not doing their part. So I think that there's, as a leader, we're talking, right? So I know I'm speaking in terms of an employee. So what I'm getting at here is there's got to be a level of self-awareness on an individual basis to make sure you're doing your part first. Of course, help people around you. But if you don't, it confuses things and it muddies up the system. Now, from a leader's perspective, where I think that having a level of self-awareness is important, is an issue that I had and have is I almost take it to the other extreme. It's not shut up and dig. It's like, oh, well, maybe he needs more time, so I'm just going to go do it for him type thing. And I would be employee A that would help employee B with everything. And then exactly, right. And then the problem would become, of course, not only would I not have the time to do my job, I've got to work on my business, but also employee B starts underperforming all of a sudden because this becomes their new expectation. They do like 70% of what I hired them to do, which is way partially my fault because I created that expectation and that workflow. And my lack of self-awareness led me to realize that when I finally would have moments of lucidity, which would normally come when I just didn't have the time to help you. And when you feel stressed out because I don't have the time to help you, I'd be like, this is your job. I mean, like you can do this. I know you can. I've done this for X, like as one person. And to them, all of a sudden, that feels like, go F yourself. But that's just because of such a contrast in what's been expected, a big change in one day.
You're like swinging between the polarities.
Exactly. But to them, it feels like, well, yesterday did not feel like today. One of these things is not like the other. What is going on? And it's not that I don't care. It's not that I don't feel for you. But to them, it feels that way. And so by my lack of self-awareness, my employee's stressed out. My employee feels like I don't care about them. My employee feels overworked. Even if it's not true, this one person can do this job, but I was protecting you too much. Not to be too long-winded about it, I think having a level of self-awareness, are you causing some of these problems? Yourself as a leader, are you creating some of these problems? Even if you have staff that feels like a staff problem, Are they undermotivated? Are they, causing trouble? Even then, are you causing some of that? It's possible that you're not, of course, right? I do believe in accountability and I want to hire intelligently. But if you're the cause of some of that, you've got to know, because if you get rid of this person, hire a new person, same problem, new person, at what point do you start to pick up on this pattern? But people would be amazed, or I guess as dog trainers, maybe we wouldn't be amazed how often the average person is willing to roll with a pattern that is clearly not working or is clearly not working optimally, just like they do with their dogs. So you've got to take time to assess and evaluate your patterns and see, does this even make sense? Am I having the impact that I think that I'm having? And the final piece, other than self-awareness, that I would add to this, or maybe related to self-awareness, is I have totally resting bitch face. And I realize that I have a way of communicating that can seem harsh. Because of this, because of all of that, I actively work, this sounds funny, but I actively work on my face and I actively work on the words that I choose to allow to come out of my mouth when I'm talking to someone. And it's not because I'm mean. I don't think that in my soul I'm a mean person. I'm very matter of fact. Very. Like, if I could be a computer, I'd be just the happiest thing in the world.
Yeah. That's why you and Dr. Hilliard are best friends.
Exactly. So I have to have a level of self-awareness, and what I'm recommending here is everyone else have a level of self-awareness. Did your matter of fact, did the way that you kind of fired off that information land the way that you meant it to land? Did you hit the target? Or did you miss it and you came across as an ass? Maybe you didn't mean to. I get it. And because you didn't mean to, maybe your pride has a hard time being like, well, I didn't do that. You got offended. I didn't offend you. But if they took it the wrong way, learn to say it differently. It's difficult for me. It's difficult for lots of people for all the different reasons. Some people are too emotional. Some people are too logistical, or whatever you would call it. But all of this requires a level of self-awareness. That's what I would say.
Two things I want to just follow up with on that. One, just based on what you literally just said. One quote that I love, I think I originally heard it from Chad Mackin, who's another dog trainer, but I don't think he's the original source of the quote. But it's when a shooter misses his mark, he doesn't blame the target. And I think about that a lot. It was a quote that I used to use with my team a lot when we were talking about okay, we've got a client and we're trying to teach them something and they're kind of not getting it. Right? It's not sticking, and it's really easy to get frustrated with them, but maybe it's well, let's just pause and maybe there's a different way we need to present this info. But it also 100% relates to what you just said. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention, about having this self-awareness, I think that's 1,000% true. And if I reflect on, 2 weeks ago, the last time we spoke, the previous conversation about thinking like a leader, and I think one of the overarching messages there of how to think like a leader was have some process of self-review and reflection, whether it's journaling, whether it's recording yourself, sort of whatever it is. And then through that process, you can start to develop very specific goals. And so a lot of times, if you're finding yourself and you're going hey, I want to be a better leader. I want to communicate better to my staff. I want to have these interactions go smoother. Cool. So step one, what's your process to be able to review those interactions? Are you going to every time you have one of those interactions, are you going to go just make a quick little journal entry about okay, here's what happened. Here's how I feel like it went. Maybe here are some things I feel like I did really well. Here are some things I think I maybe could have done better. I mean, this can literally be 3 or 4 sentences. It's not pages of note taking. It could be, again, when you have staff meetings, just making sure that you're recording audio and obviously tell the employees hey, I'm recording this. It's for my own review. I'm not judging you. It's I'm trying to improve myself here, but whatever it actually is, having a process for it, actually having a discipline for self-review, I think is insanely important. And that was literally 75% of the last episode was all about self-review and self-awareness. You can have self-awareness without having a disciplined process of self-review and reflection, but giving yourself a disciplined process, again, whether it's journaling or anything else, it sort of supercharges any existing self-awareness that you might have. It's going to amplify it. It's going to expedite this process. And you're going to start to notice patterns and things that you may not otherwise notice. And one thing I want to just mention about that is it's not just the reviewing part. It's not just okay, well, I'm going to take these notes and look back at them later. Like the act of sitting down and taking the notes by itself solidifies and clarifies and brings to light so many things that it feels like they're clear in our heads when they're just bobbling around, but we don't actually realize how inarticulate or incomplete some of those thoughts are until we try to actually put it down in an organized way. And so for me, journaling has become like an absolutely like essential part of my day for a variety of different disciplines that I'm engaged in for that reason.
Yeah, I agree, man. I think the overarching idea here, if I'm not mistaken, you guys tell me if I am, is having a level of self-awareness, giving yourself time and a layer of system to make sure that that takes place, because that's another thing that I think I lack in. And that I think that many people in a leadership position who lack the leadership skill, I think other than self-reflection, the other big piece of it is the ability to create or the ability to recognize the importance of a system. Because anybody can listen to this right now and go, wow, that was a great point, and then just never do it. The way that you find time is make the time. I constantly tell my facility manager, hey, find a day over the next couple weeks and book out X amount of hours for us to do XYZ together. Find the time and make the time. And if you do that on a regular basis, like working out or anything else, once you get into the habit of reconciling in your mind, I'm going to lose this much time to do this task, and you get enough into the habit that you don't feel the sting of the loss of the time, you feel the excitement of the gain of what you're doing with the time, then you can stop being so purposeful with, oh, I've got to put it in my calendar here and there and here and there. And the final thing is, I forget which one of you guys said it, I think it was Tyler, was you're investing in your greatest asset, the relationships of your employees and yourself. And, and my wife and I are doing this thing. It's a church thing. It's kind of like a crash course for beginners, if you will. And the point is, the motivation, the reasoning to do this is to be intentional with your relationships. If you want to be serious about improving anything, get real about it. Don't just kind of tell yourself that. Don't just kind of feel better about it because you thought about it twice yesterday. Get very serious, get very intentional about, if I want to improve things, how do I improve things? I do this and I do that and I do this and I do that. But it all boils down to create for yourself a little bit of a system until the momentum of the new thing carries itself for you, right? That's why they say go to the gym X many times a week, at least for the first few weeks. Once the habit is formed, then if you fall off 1 day, 2 days here and there, it's no big deal. But in the beginning, it's going to be very difficult.
That's very, very, very well said. I think the big thing I pull from this section for myself in my own personal growth journey as a leader, manager, was creating the conduits for communication. Right? Like getting people to feel comfortable enough to behave naturally around me, because I didn't understand, like when you become a leader or manager or an owner of something, like I just feel like one of the trainers still, and everyone gives me this like level of respect, and you're just like, I'm just a normal guy, and they just start like, I'll get a new employee and they'll be like, hi sir. I'm like, sir, like, it took a while for me to get used to like, oh, they respect me just because of my title? That's weird. I'm the youngest brother. I was never respected for my title, So it was an interesting thing to really focus on the relationship so that I can actually listen because they're actually telling me stuff. And that I can actually observe what's going on because people aren't scared of my presence when I walk into the room, And so that was my big personal growth, because I had to get past that, like, why are you guys treating me funny? Is there anything else you guys want to say on this point? Because I wanted to chat about the next point.
Just, yeah. So the final thing that I would say is just one of those cliche quotes that I think ties us perfectly into the next point, which is, I'm a huge fan in dog training, like with dogs, with clients, with staff. Before you start cutting, you measure twice. And that's why I think listening is important. Really, listening is an active process. It's not just sitting there quietly and hearing someone. It's what you do after having listened, or what you should do, is take in the information and then begin to craft the proper response for the situation. And that's how you get into things like tone. And when I start talking back to you, the process of deciding what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it, begins to take place, begins to take shape in the active listening. So measure twice before you start cutting.
Yeah. And that's actually goes straight into my next story is one of the big things that kind of changed my communication style was it's so funny because you know how they say like you keep maturing till you're 25 or something, like you don't stop growing until you're 25. I think it was around age 25 where I started
I was supposed
realizing
to be done maturing when I was 25.
physically.
Dude, I'm way behind schedule.
I got better at math when I was 25. Before
Isn't that
I
weird?
hated
Yeah.
math.
Yeah, Matt. So around age 25, you know, I think at that point I was in charge of training assistants, and I was like the training manager at my company, and so I had people working under me, and kind of I had that my uncle's mentality of like, I pay you to work, so work. You know, I don't pay you to think. Just do what I tell you to do. I have this system. I made the charts. I made the schedules. Just fricking do it, right? And I was the enforcer, right, type of leadership at the time. And the funny part is, when I was 25, something happened with my emotional awareness where I realized, I think you're hurting people's feelings. Like I didn't care before 25, but I was like, I think they're upset with you. I think they're mad at you. I think they quit. Oh, what, why is it? It couldn't have been what you did. You know what I mean? Like there is these things that were happening and I'm just like, think I'm fucking up somehow. What am I doing wrong? And it, you know, once the ego gets out of it, because the ego's telling me like, no, it's them. Like I didn't make them feel that way. They're just like that. And then I would come up with all
the
these
ego always wants to protect itself, right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I realized like, Brent, you're being a shitty communicator, right? You're coming at people at the complete wrong time, with the complete wrong approach, with the complete wrong tone. And you're actually not telling them what the purpose of the conversation. You are just somehow making them feel shitty. And that's all they remember. And like, you know how they say like people don't necessarily remember what you said. They remember how you made them feel. And it got to this point where like, man, like I was making people feel crappy. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. It's kind of just these components. And the four that we have laid out right now is kind of like, what is the purpose of this communication? The tone that we speak in, maybe the approach and the timing, and maybe a timing and approach might be interconnected somehow. But yeah, I mean, what's a good place to start? What do you guys think?
I love that lead-in story so much. You know, one thing, like, so anybody who's worked with me in recent years or has come to my workshops or anything knows, like, I talk about goals almost obsessively. And I always say that, you know, especially when I was on the floor a lot, you know, coaching my training staff, that like, if you were to ask them, you know, what does Tyler always say? Like, what's one thing that Tyler always says? It would be, what is your goal? And so I always tell people, trainers today that I coach, like before you start any training session, know what your goal is, kind of be able to articulate your plan to achieve that goal and make sure that plan actually sort of makes sense. And then I think it's also helpful to have some like, well, you know, some if thens, right? Like, what if it's not going as planned? How am I going to reassess or whatever? But I think for the point of this conversation, that so easily translates into, again, all the time and care that we put into being good dog trainers, like let's put it into being good managers too. So if I have to speak to a staff member for whatever reason, good or bad, what's my goal of this conversation? And I think one thing that I loved about the story that you led in with, Brent, was you mentioned that quote about like, people don't remember what you say, but how you made them feel. And so a lot of times it's like, my goal might be, how do I want this person to feel at the end of this conversation? Do I want them to feel encouraged? Do I want them to really feel like they need to step their game up? But again, not in like a beaten down kind of way. Like, what is my goal? What do I want to be the outcome of this? How do I want that person to walk away from this conversation? Cool. Like, what's my plan? And then that plan is those other three things, right? The tone, the approach, the timing. Like, am I going to just walk out on the floor and say, then start laying it on them in front of other staff members? Am I going to set a meeting for tomorrow? Am I going to, you know, how am I going to kind of do this thing? Are we going to go for a walk with some dogs and kind of do it casually like that? I've had situations where I'm like, you know, this is a delicate thing. I think I can bring their guard down a little if we do it actually outside of hours. I'm going to ask this person if they want to like go out for a beer later, you know, but again, starting with that point of like, what is your actual goal here? Like, what is the point, purpose, goal, etc. And then, okay, now here's my plan. Do I reasonably think that if I approach this way, that I'm going to achieve that outcome that I set out for? You know, what are the possible other ways that this person might interpret what I'm saying or how I say it, right? Like, what are those other alternatives that could be out there? But just like, I don't want, like, I was like you, like early on when I had staff, I was like the micromanager. Like, I've got this system of training dogs. I want you to do it exactly the way I do it. Don't think, just do step by step, everything. Your first lesson should look exactly like mine. And then as I grew and matured, I realized that was only limiting my team. And I became more sort of goal oriented in the sense of, I walk in, I say, hey, what's your goal for this session? Okay, they can have any goal they want to, as long as it makes sense for the case and for the reason that the owner's spending the money. What's your plan to get to that goal? Their plan might be wildly different from what my plan would have been, but does it make sense? You know, what's your timeline? Like, when do you expect that plan to work? How are you going to reassess? What are some alternatives? If they can think through, it's like I don't care what methodology they choose. I don't care if they do a completely different task in their lesson number 1 than what I would have done. If it's a clear goal that makes sense, if it's a clear plan to achieve that goal and it makes sense, we have a reasonable expectation that it's going to work, you know, it's quite logical, then it could be very different, right? Like, it can be different from me, but those are the big things that I'm looking for. And so it's the exact same stuff here if we're trying to address a human versus addressing a dog. What's my goal? What's my plan? You know, does this all seem reasonable at the end of the day?
That's a good point. There's a book that I like a lot, and it's called Get to the Point by Joel Schwartzberg. And it's not necessarily in regard to interpersonal communication when you're going to speak to someone. It's more in regards to if you're going to present a thesis, if you're going to do a presentation for a seminar. The reason that I bring that up, the reason that I feel it's relevant, is because it does force you to think, what's your point? At the end of the day, what is it that I'm trying to convey? And in any good presentation, as Tyler was saying, the rule of speaking to an individual is very similar to the rule of trying to kind of rowdy the crowd, right? Is I have my information, I have my point. What feel do I want to add onto that? Is this meant to be a bit of a harder conversation? Is this meant to be very inspiring? Is this meant to be funny? Now, the second thing that I was saying I was going to bring up just now is there are lots of verbal elements to how you can paint your point. So, for example, Tyler said something
on your resting bitch face. That's
man, leave me alone, all right? No, have you guys started saying succulent yet?
Succulent.
All day.
This
Good.
Episode's pretty succulent.
Good. No, here's a nonverbal example that Tyler just made, and it was a perfect one. An easy way to make a conversation feel less heavy, less formal. You want to go for a beer? And the funny thing is, you could say it in exactly how you would have said it in the office, but the change of setting and the assumption of the change of setting, this has to be informal, we're chilling, we're at the bar, we're just two bros, you know, we're kind of off the clock. Just little things like that dramatically changes how the person might pick up on the meaning that you're trying to put out there. So just get into the habit of thinking, and just know that there are a few resources out there. One is a book. I'll put these in the description, by the way, so don't feel pressured to like write these down in a hurry or memorize them, but Get to the Point by Joel Schwartzberg. Confessions of a Public Speaker. This is a really fun one. And this one may surprise you guys, maybe not. The Well-Spoken Thesaurus. And it's a literal thesaurus, but the first chapter or two, before it gets to being an actual thesaurus, are the writer's favorite literary devices and tips and tricks of their favorite writers. And they don't just put it there and leave it for your interpretation. They put it there and explain. See, the cool thing about Hemingway writing it like this was it makes you feel like that. It's the same info, and I'm going to write it differently so that you can see it's the same info in a different way. But how you say things can take on an entirely new meaning. So just get into the habit of thinking, what's the point of what you're going to say? And like Tyler was saying, is there a probability that they're going to take it differently than what you thought? And if there is, no plan is perfect and you'll have to adjust, but you can try your best to paint it in the direction that's likely to land. I think of it like a quarterback. I'm going to throw where the receiver is going to be, right? So if somebody's really sensitive, I might be a little extra soft with my wording, so to speak, in the hopes that they don't take what I meant in a harsher sense than how I meant it.
And like, you know, like, it's okay to screw up. Like, sometimes you get it wrong. And like, there have been times both as a manager where I've gotten it wrong. And I would say, you know, more recently as a parent, right? Like, parenting's it's a journey, you know, where even, I'll just tell the story really quick, like, cause it literally just happened like 2 days ago. My daughter can be a little bit more, I guess I'll say, like, emotionally volatile. Like she has very big emotions that she feels in a very outward way. And so we're always trying to work with her. She's only 7, by the way. We're always trying to work with her on like using her words to express herself, and like so we can have a conversation about how she's feeling before it becomes this massive eruption. And the other day, something happened between her and my son, and I think she like whacked him or something, and she got sent to her room. And then she came down the stairs and she tried to explain to me like why she was upset, like what he did, essentially why she was upset. And my response was just this immediate like, yeah, but like, that's not an excuse. You can't whack him, da da da. And then I saw this, like her face just drop, and she like ran back up the stairs into her room. And I like sat there for a minute. Like at first my reaction was like, well, she's just got to she's going to have to figure this crap out. Right. But then I realized, I'm like, you know what? Like totally biffed that. Like she came down the stairs and tried to do exactly what we've been trying to encourage her to do. And I basically gaslit her. Like essentially, that's exactly what happened. Like I basically just like crapped on what she was trying to tell me. And so I walked up to her room and I knocked and I went in. I said, you know what? I'm really sorry. You tried to do this and I responded in this way. And that was really incorrect. And I need to do better. She looked at me and she gave me a hug, and like that was the end of it. And like we were able to sort of move on. But I've definitely had those moments with my team as well. There's probably other moments where I didn't recognize I was wrong that they can probably think of. But I know there were some moments where like I would have conversations and then in hindsight be like, man, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. And sometimes being a really good leader and being a really good listener, like recognizing that they didn't receive it the way you wanted them to, is actually like going back and saying like, hey, like that didn't go, like that's not how I wanted that to go. My apologies. Like this is what I did wrong there. This is what I wanted to convey. This was the mistake I made. I'm going to try not to do that again. Like that's on me. And talk about like, building like that trust and rapport and that sense of like openness with your staff. Like, I think that can be really, really important. Obviously we don't want to go overboard with it, right? Like we don't want to be like overly apologetic about just like, sometimes we got to be firm and like, it is what it is. And like you do as a staff member, sometimes need to realize that like, I'm shouldering some things that you may not necessarily have a way to wrap your head around. But I think more commonly or very commonly as managers, we also run into a trap of like, we want our staff members to be like, to have some sense of perspective about those stresses that we're dealing with. But if they've never been a manager, if they've never owned a business, they have no frame of reference for it. Like it's completely unfair to have that expectation. No more than like, I can't expect my 7-year-old to understand the burdens of being an adult. Like, you have no frame of reference for that in any way, shape, or form. So it is like a delicate balance. But I do think like, again, like pausing, knowing what you did intend, like having that sense of like, what was my purpose? What was my intended outcome of this conversation? Recognizing when it didn't go right, and then pausing and going like, was there anything that I did that might have contributed to that not going right? I mean, sometimes like we've mentioned, or I think maybe we were talking about it before we started recording, like, I think it was the quote from Alex Hormozy or something about like, it's either like the system, the way you're teaching the system, or it's the person. Like sometimes there are just bad eggs. I mean, I will just say like, as somebody who's managed a lot of people, like there are just people that are just bad employees, like at the end of the day. But I think the vast majority of people have to have it in them to be really good. We've just got to give them the right mentorship ultimately. That the bad eggs tend to sort of weed themselves out pretty darn quickly. And there's nothing worse than having like a long time employee that's been with you for years and then all of a sudden having some kind of riff with them. Like they wouldn't have been there that long if they were like a horrible person.
Yeah, you learning how to apologize. Like to your point, you don't want to apologize all the time, but like when I was 25 and I was realizing like, I think I'm hurting their feelings. It was around a similar time I was like getting into like Simon Sinek and like Chris Voss, the hostage negotiator. And he has this technique where he just goes, if someone looks upset, he goes, having a hard day. Like you ask them, that you tell them, looks like, sounds like, feels like, type stuff. Sometimes I would be completely unaware what I did. I just know that they left that meeting upset or sad or broken or whatever it is. And so I'd come back to them later and I go, hey, there's something I did that hurt your feelings or made you upset. And that doesn't sit right with me. Could you tell me what I did? And going back to stage one, observing and listening, it's like I observed that. And then now I'm giving them an opportunity to tell me what I did wrong. And it was so funny because like I started becoming more, I knew I did something wrong. They were able to verbalize. And when I approached them and told them, I know I fucked up. Can you tell me how I fucked up? It made us closer. You know what I mean? It made us closer. And it's just crazy. It's crazy how, and in essence, it taught me how to at least identify the problem, ask for information on that problem, and then genuinely apologize.
And I think that's so much easier, like just to kind of keep going back to that original idea of like, it's so much easier when prior to having the conversation, you took the time to go, what do I want to be the outcome of this? How do I want this person to feel or to receive this information? Because otherwise we can just go in like, my only outcome is like to say what I want to say, to like get this thing off my chest or to address this problem and not have the outcome be about how that information is received. And so if we're only just like, I just need to say this, I just need to address this thing happened. And it's sort of like, well, that didn't go well, but it wasn't like, but I actually tried to make it go one way and it didn't. So it's really hard then for us to go back to that person and be like, well, that's not how I wanted you to take that information. Well, did you give any thought to how you wanted them to take it? Like, so it kind of starts with like, okay, listen. And then again, go into this thing with a plan. What is your purpose? What is the objective of this? But that objection needs to be, not just like, I need them to get the actual information, like specifically understand like these details, but part of the objective needs to be, how do I want them to receive this in an ideal situation? Like, how do I want to try to make this person feel? Again, it's not always roses, right? I've had employees where like, I need to knock this guy down a peg because this person thinks that have way more power here than they do, right? Like that's something that is real. But again, like okay, so what does knocking them down a peg look like? How do you knock them down a peg constructively, right? Like, so again, it's not always like, I want to build this person up. I want to inspire. Like there are sometimes like some harsher things as a manager, but it still requires the same degree of thoughtfulness.
Yeah, totally. The funny thing is the fear, at least as I see it and I feel it, is how do I knock someone down a peg without accidentally knocking them down 2 or 3? And it's hard to even conceptualize what that would feel like to them. And therefore, it's hard to know how much knocking do I need to do, right? Something that I try to do when we're discussing tone, like how do I want to come across to you? Or at least how do I want to try my best to come across to you? Because there is a percentage of that's out of your hands at the end of the day. I don't know if this is super helpful advice, but it's what everyone does naturally. They tell you in the beginning, before the information, what the intended tone is. Somebody will sit you down and say, hey, just please understand, I mean this in the best of ways. And again, I don't know if that's the best advice. God knows I'm not necessarily the best when it comes to tone. I just see it with everyone in almost every context. And when someone does it to me, it makes sense. I don't think that I'm someone who's very sensitive to tone, but I do get more, I feel a little bit warmer about you when you make it obvious to me you are mindful of your own tone. Like, it won't matter to me anyway. Even if you rub me the wrong way, I just kind of don't care. But if somebody were like, listen, I hope I don't say this the wrong way. I just really, what I want you to understand is this thing. And then they get into saying it. And once they've gotten into saying it, now I see where the rub is and I see why they felt the need to give me this disclaimer. But sometimes the disclaimer actually can be nice. At least I think. So take that if it's valuable.
I do that
to you.
all the time with like customer service representatives. A lot of times I have to be like, listen, if you're hearing frustration in my voice, I'm not frustrated with you.
Right.
I'm frustrated with your company.
Right.
I know you're just trying to do your job and you're doing your best. So I'm not mad at you, but you're probably sensing some anger in my tone here. And here, then that's why it is. Yeah. But also like, just make sure like you can't be like, hey, I mean this in the most loving way, and then proceed to tell them like why they're a piece of shit. Like it has to be like, it has to be, the stars have to align in a way.
Yeah. I just want to unpack kind of like the different types of tones that kind of might get us in trouble. Like condescension is one, like thinking people have malice and treating them as that, like frustration, anger, like what are some other tones that get leaders and management in trouble? Assumptive tones, like, so I heard that you did, or like, so is that true? Like, with the question, like little tones. I just want to bring them up to people can unpack them. And
I think like the flip side of the like of being condescending or degrading or anything like that is also, again, like having a tone of like being overly apologetic, overly soft, not being assertive enough. And I think that's a real danger in this business. And the reason why, I think one of the big challenges that I certainly struggled with myself, but I also, again, with the dog trainers that I work with that have teams, is if you're in this line of work, like it's a service-based business. So again, like your staff is your biggest asset. If you only have 5 employees and one person quits, you just lost 20% of your workforce. And if you're booked 4 weeks out in advance and all your other staff members are fully booked, you've got all these clients that you have to service, like that's a really stressful event. And I think a lot of times what happens is when managers have to address things with employees, sometimes like fear is a big factor, right? The fear of driving this person off, or the fear of like, oh, I don't want to address this right now because I don't want to make them quit, so on and so forth. And looking back at my whole career, I will tell you that like allowing fear in that way to color any of my decision making when it came to HR issues was unequivocally like almost always a mistake. Some of the biggest problems that ended up snowballing into way bigger problems were the result of inaction or failure to act assertively enough out of that sense of fear. And so while I do think, yes, there are definitely going to be managers out there or people listening that maybe, again, whether it's the facial expression they have like Mariano, or they just tend to express themselves with a certain tone, that can be an issue. I do think there is a considerable amount of people that like they have a problem employee and they're not addressing it directly enough, right? Like just be direct about it and don't wait. Like definitely it's way harder when you wait. And those decisions as far as how they're addressing it and when they're addressing it or not addressing it are fear-based decisions. And fear-based decisions, unless you're actually in a survival situation, are rarely good decisions.
Yeah, 100%. I wanted to chat and maybe timing the next two variables, the timing and approach. Mariano, you I don't want to ruin the quote, but I think you know what quote, the whole like a bad idea at the wrong time, or what is the actual quote?
Yeah, the Henry Gracie quote. It's the right move at the wrong time is the wrong move.
Yeah. And, timing and having conversations. You mentioned, Tyler, like, maybe we go for a walk. That's something my mentor used to do all the time. He would take me for a walk around up and down the block. Maybe we go for
a leash and a prong collar.
Exactly. E-collar.
Make you walk at his side.
Yeah. From behind and to the left. But yeah, no, it did the timing, the approach. No one can actually, when someone's under stress, they can't really take criticism. But yeah, let's riff a little bit on that, like timing, approach. We mentioned a little bit, but just want to see what else there is.
Yeah, I think
to squeeze out of that.
A lot of what we kind of talked about so far was like the delicacy of timing, and in a sense of like, again, if there's something that is a tougher conversation, that doing it on a walk or going out to lunch or going for a beer, not addressing it in front of other team members, like those things are all super important. I think one aspect of timing that hasn't been talked on a lot, I just mentioned it sort of briefly in my previous statement, though, again, something that I found was took me a while to kind of figure this out, was especially when it came to addressing mistakes or oversights and things like that, like not waiting. It's just really, really important. So it's very difficult to bring somebody in like 3 weeks later and be like, okay, so remember like 4 Thursdays ago when this thing happened and and like, I didn't say anything to you then about it, but like it's become a problem and Like when you notice something, you kind of want to get on it right away when it's fresh in everybody's mind. Again, then the more fine-tuned timing of it, like within that day, am I going to do this right here and now? Do I need to just go to my office and like think this through of how I want to approach this first? Do I want to do it at the end of their day so they're not, if they are disgruntled, they're not spending the rest of their workday like stirring the pot and creating toxicity with the rest of the team? Do I want to go on a walk? Whatever it is, right? But I think one very crucial thing is don't sit on problems. Address them when they happen and address them very, very directly. Just be to the point about it. Channel your inner Ron Swanson. Like just, state the facts. Or like I love Captain Holt from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I think I mentioned both those two characters on the last episode that we did together because both of them like the way they speak, it's just, there's like no opinion. It's just, these are the facts of what is happening right now. And not that like that's going to work in the real world, but it's that directness where again, what is your point? Like get to the point, like Mariano said from that book, but definitely not delaying. Again, it's uncomfortable. You're going to not want to do it. It's an easy thing to procrastinate on, but it's almost always, even if it doesn't make it worse necessarily, it's every day that passes from the event to when you address it, it becomes more and more and more awkward and difficult to address.
I completely agree. I would add, like within the day, I agree. You take care of a problem when it's a problem, not later, because then it's strange. Then it becomes a problem in itself because now you're making issue out of something that was 4 weeks ago, and it makes you look not good, right? So what I would add to that would be, if you're listening to this and you're someone who has enough self-awareness to understand, I do need to craft my thoughts and my approach on this. I'm not good at just freestyling this. Typically things, if I do that, will just kind of spiral out of control for one reason or another. Is I would say, get it done that day, but I'm a big fan of planting bugs in people's ears. You can simply tell someone, hey dude, what time are you taking lunch? 2:00? Okay, cool. Do me a favor when you're done, give me 5 minutes, jump into the office. I just want to talk to you. And now they're aware, they're not going to be blindsided. And now you've put a bookmark in the time of day that you're going to do it. And that'll put a little fire under you to get your thoughts together, get your act together, get your emotions out of your, like grow up, right? And you both know what's going to happen, what the conversation is going to be about. So and some people just struggle because they just struggle. And I've met lots of people that they come across by mistake way harsher or way more emotional or angry because they're afraid and they just hate the confrontation, and you can see their hand shaking and all these kinds of things. So I would say the easy way to disarm lots of that is plan for it. Hey man, yeah, look, can I talk to you later about this thing? Don't stress, you. We're good. I just want to see you at 3. Can you do that? Can you see me at 3 after your lesson? And then you have time to prepare. They kind of have time to settle themselves as well, because nobody likes being called into the boss's office. But it's a bit easier when you have an hour or two to kind of rationalize, like, I know what I'm going to say. Everybody picks their words out, right? So if that's helpful to you, and I would say that there are times when maybe you don't want to do that. Probably when you need to, the times that you wouldn't do this, in my opinion, there are some people who constantly struggle to take responsibility or accountability. And if you give them time, like a lawyer, to craft their defense, then it just makes the conversation harder, not easier. But barring that type of person or that type of conversation, I personally find it very helpful to just be like, hey, I want to talk to you about this at this time. Is that good? Cool.
It's so funny. I've done that, and I've done it for good reasons. I've been like, hey, I want to talk to you about, giving you your days off or whatever it is. And there's been a couple times where the employee was like ruminating for 2 months or for 2 hours, and they're like, oh shit. And then they come in and I tell them what we were going to talk about, and they're like, that's not what I thought this was about. So now I'm like, so what did you think it was going to be about?
They come in, they're all sweaty, they're bags under their eyes.
But there's been a couple things that have been revealed of like, oh, I didn't even know about that. But you need to sit down and we need to talk about it now. Yeah. So it was a funny result.
That's definitely funny, but I would say, like, all jokes aside, tell them what it's going to be about. That's what planting a bug is, This sounds really like funny as I say it, but the police call us pretty often, not for the reason you would think. We donate to the cop and kid, thing where they like buy school materials and gifts for Christmas time and whatever. So whenever they call us, now it's not weird, but the first couple times they're like, hey, this is Phoenix PD. And the very next words out of their mouth before anybody gets to say anything is, don't worry, this is a friendly call. So there's nothing wrong with being like, hey dude, can I pull you after lunch and talk to you? It's just about this thing. And then once they hear you say that, they go, oh, okay. And you can see the immediate relaxation. So tell them what it's about.
Yeah, I personally cannot stand if somebody is like, tries to, like, I mean, especially if it's like an employee or something like that, tries to schedule a meeting. They're like, hey, like, I need to talk to you. Like, can we meet at this time? And they give me no sense of what it's about. It drives me up the wall. Like, tell me what it is. Tell me what it is. Like, tell me what I'm walking into here, Yeah.
And just not to put too fine of a point on what we've been talking about of approach and tone, lots of people, workplace related, personal, etc. Lots of people don't tell you what it's about because in their mind, they just don't want to get into it right now. And lots of people are really bad about that. Once I tell you what it's about, well, you just start responding and defending. So then it becomes the conversation now when the intention was to make it later. And for that reason, people try to safeguard themselves by just wait till 3. However, the way it feels to the other person is very underhanded. It's like, why do you expect that it's okay to just blindside me? Clearly, you have access to me. You just told me we're going to talk. Not telling me what it's about is rude. You expect me to just sit here and simmer? Do I think on all my sins for today and then find out which one you're going to pick? It's not nice. But my point in that is it's just another example of your approach may have been very innocent. The reason you didn't say something may well have been very innocent in your mind. That doesn't mean that that's how I pick it up. So if you're going to bring that up, I do think that that's a helpful skill. Like I said, plan it for later, but tell them what it's about, because even if you have your own reasons for not wanting to say it, they're not going to appreciate that reason. Nobody likes being blindsided, and nobody likes knowing they're going to be blindsided. That sounds like an oxymoron, but it's like, Tyler, I have this really important thing to tell you. I'm going to call you later, but I'm not going to tell you right now. I'm just going to tell you later. It's not fair.
If I were to just kind of reflecting on everything that's been said here. So point 1, the observing and listening, and then the sort of second point here about actually communicating. I think one major takeaway, if nothing else, is put yourself in the perspective of the receiver and try to imagine what it would feel like if you were them and somebody was saying this to you in that way, whatever it is, whether it's you're actually in that meeting and addressing it, or like you mentioned right now, Mariano, if you say hey, can we talk at 3 p.m.? Okay, imagine yourself in that. I just mentioned that I hate it. I get so much anxiety when somebody does that to me. And so then recognize, well, if you hate it, they probably do too. And again, what's your whole objective here? Was your objective of saying, hey, meet me at 3, that you wanted them to sit there and simmer? I mean, if that's what you wanted, then rock on. But unless that was your objective, and again, it's that extra step of, again, measure twice, cut once, like you said earlier. So part of that measuring is what's my objective? But then, okay, now if I were in that receiving seat, is that the way it would come across? Is that is that how it would sort of go down? Empathy or compassion or whatever, but just putting yourself in their shoes, being the target, right? Again, if the shooter misses his mark, he doesn't blame the target kind of situation. But first it's well, what's that feel like to be that target of that information? I think it's if you can do that, I think you're probably going to mitigate a lot of the problems that you could probably sum it down to being to that kind of simplicity. Know your objective and then put yourself in their shoes and say, is that the way you think it's going to go? Is that how you would take it if your manager said that to you?
Yeah, definitely. I think, that's a perfect way to kind of round it out and put it in a nutshell. We want to take a quick little commercial break, and then we're going to come back and do a little review and then go over our very last point. We'll see you guys in a second. Bye-bye.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to Dog Trainers Podcast. You know what's a great way to support this podcast? By becoming a sponsor today. With sponsoring the podcast, you'll be helping us make this show the best it can be, and so much more. From hosting more local events, traveling throughout the country, and connecting with trainers from around the world. Ultimately getting you, the listener, more of the content that you love. For more information, please contact us at dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com or visit our Instagram page at dogtrainerspodcast. Thank you guys, and now back to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome back, and thank you again so much for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast. Before we went on break, we were having some really cool conversation. Thanks again to our guest, Tyler Muto. We were talking about a couple of major points in helping you improve your communication skills when you're in a leadership position. We started by going over some ideas on observing, basically taking time to really hear someone out and craft what your response is going to be instead of just reacting. Right? You kind of take a minute. The second point that we had covered were some major principles on communicating better. We talked about purpose, we talked about approach, tone, and timing. And we wanted to bring it back with our third and final point, which is getting into some more specific ideas on what it means to be a better teacher, what it means to be a better trainer, where these things overlap like a Venn diagram, where they're different, where they're similar. And with that being said, I'm going to kick it right back over to Brent. Over to you, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, man. So when we kind of bring teaching and training to the forefront, like we know as dog trainers, there's a difference between teaching and training, right? And the way that I would break it down is teaching is for like comprehension. Like I understand the theory or I understand the purpose. I understand the why, if you will. And then the training is actually teaching the practical skill, the physical skill, and the execution of that, right? And as Mariano said, there's a Venn diagram where sometimes you are learning through doing, and you learn to do better the more that you learn, right? But sometimes what happens as leaders, and this is something that I dealt with, again, I think it all comes down to ego, where one of the worst thoughts that I could think of was for myself was that the way I did it was the right way, number one. The way I think is the right way to think, and also assuming everyone should think and or do it the way that I want to do it. And so what happens, I remember when it's kind of like dogs, right? Like dogs I would train are the ones that were more like me. Like the ones I really liked, my favorite dog were the dogs that were kind of like me. They were easy to train. Same thing with employees.
The ugly ones?
The ugly ones, exactly. The hairy one. Yeah, the Peruvian ones. Yeah, so like with employees, it was like people who had similar minds. That's actually one of the reasons me and Mariano are friends. Like me and Mariano worked easily together because he had kind of like this dutiful, let's get it done attitude, and so did I. And so we meshed, and he came and worked with me in a time where I was learning all this management stuff and I sucked at it, and he can attest to that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I assumed people, like I only wanted people who thought like me and did things like me, or at least had the same principles or creed of me when it came to work. And what I realized is like, not everyone is that way. And sometimes they have to be taught skills. They have to be taught ways of thinking. This whole episode was because I was building up a leadership course for my managers and my leads at work. And I started realizing there was so much conflict because they weren't getting to the point, and they were approaching each other with the wrong tone, and they weren't teaching the new hire the same stuff that a more experienced lead would teach them. And so we kind of broke up these points to kind of fill in all those gaps. And so I guess I just want to start riffing with you guys. Do you guys feel that there's a difference between the teaching and training?
Possibly. I recently did an episode on teaching, and it highlighted, I think, the most important part. And we talked about this. All of us talked about this. The most important part of teaching is to establish a plan before you start teaching. And that, I think, can be sort of unique. When you're teaching, you have to teach other people how to plan for themselves. Whereas, like in my mind, it looks like this. It's not necessarily teaching versus training, because those are extremely similar. I think of it as teaching versus working versus doing the thing. And I don't know if that's the best way to look at it, but the difference in my mind looks like this. When I'm teaching new things, you're learning new things. Learning is a difficult skill. Learning takes time. Learning takes mental energy and effort. And so I have to be very thoughtful and methodical with how I teach you to make sure that you learn it, right? Versus once you've learned it, and I understand there's ongoing learning, but once you've learned the meat of the task, just as a model of efficiency, just to make sure we don't run out of energy, there's a reason that walking isn't hard anymore and driving isn't hard anymore. Your brain kind of tunes out on the things that are more or less autonomous. And I think of teaching and doing as this ebb and flow of, when am I thoughtful? When am I not? What can I focus on? What can I not? And so when I take that model and I apply it to staff, to dogs, to clients, XYZ, my wife, whatever, right?
You said that with such a loving tone.
No, it's not a frustration. It's an importance thing. I've been so serious this last couple of years.
If your wife listens to this episode and goes like, he's trying to teach me things? He's trying to train me?
Right, exactly. I like to use the word train. I'm just kidding. That everybody, I love my wife. McKenna's the best. She listens to these. She'll hit me for it. Don't worry. So when I approach anybody with this sort of attitude, the way that I look at it is twofold. I want to know what I can focus on and what I don't need to focus on. And I want to be able to tell them as quickly as possible in the interaction what they need to focus on, what they don't need to focus on. Because I'm a massive overthinker, if you guys haven't found that out by now. And I'm one of those that somebody will be actively giving me information that I know is important and I know I should be paying attention. But you gave me one piece of info, two pieces of info, and now I'm starting to analyze that, and I'm missing 3, 4, and 5. So what I do to avoid this is I tell people right up front, here's what we're going to do. I establish a workflow, which includes time for questions and clarification. That way, if you have questions, you're not going to spend the next 2 minutes stressing about, should I ask it now? How about now? How about now? You just know, hang on for 10 minutes. We're going to pause and do this thing, which means for the next 10 minutes, just stay with me. Listen to me, right? And once we get into the meat of all of the teaching portion, like we talked about, then we can go over very quickly, because this isn't something that needs a lot of discussion. Here's how you can make it quick and efficient so that you're, to a degree, kind of mindless. Like there is think and there is dig, and I think that they're both very important. So that's the sort of dichotomy that I try to keep in my mind. So I don't look at necessarily as teaching training. I think of it as teaching doing.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think like the things that, like, just kind of use the original language, like the things that we can separate, like teaching and training, are like skills, like things that you do. So for instance, like if I want to learn more about American history, like somebody can teach me American history. They're not going to train me in American history. Like there's not an action involved there. But if I want to become a history teacher, then I have to learn principles of teaching, and then I have to practice actually teaching to be trained at that skill. Similar to dog training, if I'm going to teach somebody how to train dogs, like I can teach them some of the sort of more academic aspects, right? Like I can make sure that they can tell me what positive reinforcement is versus negative reinforcement and give me examples of each. And I can teach them that. But training them is like, okay, now let's actually do it. And I need to give you feedback on your actions, and we need to get it with repetition. And I need to coach you along until you gain competency in the doing. And that's what the training aspect is. So like I always say, like, you can't learn how to train dogs just from reading a book. At some point, you have to actually do it and develop that skill set. And I think ultimately, like, again, being a good leader or manager or whatnot is sort of the same idea. And one trap that I think it's so easy to fall in, that I've kind of tried as I've prepared myself mentally for these episodes to try to help with a little bit, is like, I think we all, like, we might get an Instagram reel from, you know, Adam Grant or somebody who's like an influencer in the like leadership space, right? And they say something, we're like, oh yeah, like totally, like it resonates with us. I'm super inspired by what that guy just said in that 1.5-minute long video. But like actually building it into our daily practice is a whole different thing. Like we might read a book and it all makes a lot of sense, but then it doesn't ever become incorporated into our practice. And I think similarly, people can easily listen to these podcasts right here. Like, oh yeah, I love what they just said. Oh, that makes so much sense. Oh, I could totally improve there. And so they're learning it, right? Like it's in their head, they're aware of it, but then it doesn't become action. And so one thing that I kind of just circle back around on for me, if we're really, so like one thing is like, how do we train our trainers, for instance? Like that's a whole skill set, but also just for ourselves, right? How do we make sure that we aren't just learning this info, but that we're actually being trained to do it? Is, again, once we sort of recognize and commit to sort of devoting ourselves to improving this skill set, we don't want to just have abstract goals. Like, I want to be a better leader. I want to be a better communicator. I vow to make somebody feel better, X, Y, and Z. What we want to do is say, okay, cool, but what are actions that, if repeatedly taken, I have a reasonable expectation it's going to move me towards that more amorphous kind of goal, right? So for instance, it could just simply be, okay, I want to get better at when I communicate with my staff, like coming across more compassionate or whatever it is. Okay, what's an action I can take? Well, an action I can take is anytime I have something where I have to address staff, I'm going to go and I'm going to write down, 3 bullet points about that interaction, right? I'm going to take that, and I can have reasonable expectation that if I do this, I'm going to start to improve. Or, I find that I'm having these conversations and people are walking out and very clearly it's not going the way I want it to. What's an action I can take? Well, an action I can take is, before any staff meeting, I'm going to actually write out, what is the information I want to make sure I get across, and what is the feeling I want to get across. And I'm going to write these things out, and then, okay, cool. So now what's my plan for addressing that? Do I have reason to expect that? Right. But the action of writing those things out, like, that's how we then start to train ourselves. So what we really want is, like, always take any, like, so many of But when people think about goals, usually it's outcome related, right? The goal is the outcome. And what I try really hard with people that I coach is, okay, it's good to have those aspirations based on outcome, but let's set goals based on actions that we can take because we're 100% in control. So for whatever outcome we're trying to achieve, let's identify an action that, if done repeatedly, should have a high expectancy of moving us towards that outcome. And then our goal is just about that discipline, right? Creating consistency around that. So if we go, hey, my goal is I want to get stronger. Okay, like cool. But like, how about my goal is for the next 30 days, I'm going to show up at the gym at least 3 days a week. And I have an expectation that if I do that, I'm going to get stronger. But the goal is like, hey, I might show up to the gym. Maybe I get sick mid-month, or like these things could happen that maybe like I don't end up stronger. You know, maybe I'm not really doing great exercises at first because I haven't worked out in 17 years. So my form is terrible. And like, I'm not getting stronger in a month. Right. And so you go through that month and you feel depleted because the outcome wasn't met yet. Or we could say, you know what, like my goal is to show up. My goal is to do this action. I'm fully in control of that. And if I do that action, regardless of the outcome, I can feel really good about myself and I can say goal achieved. And if I need to then reassess my actions, I can. Like, so it could just be like, okay, cool. Like now let's do that for another 30 days. Or it could be, okay, you know what? Like I did this for 30 days. It's not feeling like it's going to move the needle. Let me reassess this. What's a different action I can take, or how can I tweak this action? But I think like always, you know, which I'm not sure if that's totally where you guys wanted to go on this topic, but if our goal here is to help, you know, coach people along through the podcast to be better leaders, then that's exactly it. Like you can listen to this podcast, you can learn the information, we can teach it to you in that sense, but that's not enough. You have to train we're not there. Like I'm not there to sit there and watch you interact with your staff. So you have to become your own coach. And again, I think the absolute cornerstone of that is self-review and reflection. Like I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's just so meaningful.
Yeah.
But it is ultimately all of these things we're talking about. What are the actions? So pick a goal, pick something specific you're trying to get better, be as specific as possible, and then pick an action that, if repeated, should move that needle, and build your goals around that. Build those habits in. You will start to see change ultimately. But just listening to a podcast, just watching a video, just taking an online course, just reading a book, it's not going to change anything.
I want to add just two quick things to that. Number one, in the interest of turning a goal into a series of steps, turning a goal into a plan, essentially. One way that I was working on, last episode, we were talking about not just journaling, but we were talking specifically about the, you know, my friend Clark's program and the importance of asking yourself good questions and XYZ. So that, you know, one thing he had us do was a sort of a mind map. You take a piece of paper, draw a huge circle, and then you draw like 4 smaller circles inside the big circle, like a target. And the outermost circle, the biggest one, you write the word someday on it. And then in that you write, 5 years. And then in the next one, 2 years, and the next one, 2 months or whatever. And you get down into bite-sized amounts of time, like a month, a week, a day. And eventually it's someday, right? So in the someday category, you write out your goal. I want to be able to teach like Michael Ellis. I want to be able to guide business and have a smooth running business like Tyler Muto. And then in the very next rung, that means in 5 years' time, I should be, halfway there. And the next rung, that means in 2 years' time, I should be a quarter of the way there, and so on and so on and so on. And once you've kind of given yourself that, then you start asking yourself questions. In order for me to start and be a quarter of the way there in 2 years' time, what do I need to do? Because 2 years is going to come whether I get better or not. So what steps do I need to take that are different, better, etc.? And then you start listing that out, and then you start asking yourself honest questions. When you get down to the week and the day, these were the steps we decided we need to take. Did you do them? Yes or no? I don't want excuses, right? It's sort of a yes or no answer. Did you do your thing? No. And then after you can say, well, why not? And then after that, you ask yourself, was that excuse valid? Yes or no? Right? And it's a cool way to create a plan so that you have the end result in mind without focusing so much on it that you forget that you've got to move your feet step by step. Right. And then the second thing I wanted to say about that, I think that's called goal setting, by the way, the goal setting worksheet for anybody who wants to look that up. The second thing that I wanted to say about that is when you're focused so much on the stress of it, it just sounds so daunting. There's nothing wrong with making a goal that involves help. So for example, Tyler does mentorship. Lots of people do mentorship. We've been tossing around some ideas that, that the three of us will kind of discuss and bring out. But long story short, even if your goal, your short-term goal, in order to improve your long-term output, is to seek help, then maybe you can make a smaller, more manageable, faster goal. Perhaps for the next 2 months, I don't know, I need to take on X many more lessons so that I've got a little bit of extra cash in my pocket and I can lean on some of Tyler's time and expertise. Or I know that this seminar is coming. I know that there's this mentor in my area. You can create small goals to just help you get to step 2. That's an option. Or you can try the goal setting worksheet and really ask yourself, what do I want to be as a trainer, as a business owner, XYZ? And then start managing that down into, that means today I have to do what, and by the end of this week I have to do what else, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, you guys are, again, it starts with us as the leaders. And I want to kind of go into, as leaders, assessing our staff's comprehension or our right hand's comprehension of things, and kind of asking ourselves the question, like, once we know what we want, do we know how to, make sure that they know how to do the job that we're asking them to do, and do they comprehend the tasks? And so this whole model that we brought up before the commercial break, we were talking about the Alex Hermosi. I don't think he made it up, but I think it's something I heard him talk a lot about when I was listening to him. But he was saying, if there's a problem performance-wise within a company, he goes, there's always 3 variables you have to look at. First variable, the system that your employees are supposed to follow. Like, is there a system in place, a step-by-step, protocol? Number 2, is the person that's having the performance problem properly trained on that system, right? And then also there is a possibility it could just actually be the person. Tyler mentioned that sometimes there's just bad eggs that we hire. But one of the reason for this is we can't just jump to the conclusion that, there's a bad egg, right? And that person's just bad. Or they just don't want to do the work, or they're lazy, or they just don't want to do the job. And so part of what he recommends is he says, okay, let's ask the person who's been trained, what do I do in this situation? What would you do in this situation? Have them break down to you their comprehension and understanding of what the process should be. Now, if that person breaks down to you exactly what you have in your system, right? And they're doing it to a T, and we're not necessarily getting the results that we want, well, it's either something's wrong with the system, or the person knows the system and is just not doing it. You know what I mean? And then what we have to do is sometimes we might even have to ask that person to show us them doing it, right? So the reason I want to talk about teaching and training is, I'm a big believer that, people don't wake up in the morning wanting to suck at stuff, right? And as trainers of dogs and trainers of people, like, I had someone who really, my mentor put a lot of years into me, guiding me, adjusting me, correcting me, helping me out along the way. And those little nudges really, really go a long way. One thing that I've really seen has helped my staff is when I became more present and I became more of that mentor style leader, and I started making sure I saw the weaknesses in their comprehension of things. Oh, you don't even know why you're doing that. Let me fill that in for you. You don't even know how to actually do that. You're supposed to control the daycare yard, but you don't even know how. So then we started creating systems and classes and workshops for just staff to make sure that those gaps get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And a lot of, like, I mentored 2 trainers last year. And when I asked them, one of them was a pack walker. And I said, all right, you hire a new staff member. What's their training protocol? Like how do you train them to become a pack walker? And they go, they just kind of shadow and kind of watch us pack walk. And when they watch us pack walk, they kind of pick it up as they go. And I was like, so you don't have a system. Like, you don't have a checklist or anything like that. Have you experienced anything like that, Tyler?
Well, of course. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if people don't have systems in place, well, we got to work on that system. And then are we taking the time? So sometimes we might give people a list or a checklist, like follow this, but they actually need to sometimes be walked through those steps. And I think that's the training process, right? Sometimes they need to repeat a skill over and over and over until they get sharper and better at it. one of the big ones for me is daycare, right? So we do what I loved about when we went to visit you in Buffalo is how you guys were doing all the enrichment, right? But when we went to go visit you, COVID, you guys stopped traditional daycare and you started doing more enrichment and like fulfillment for the dogs and as a daily service. And I took inspiration from that. And so we do something like that now, but we do treadmill, we do agility, we do free play, monitored free play. But my goal is like my whole staff is trained on how to control 25 dogs. Most of these dogs are trained because it's a training facility, right? And so and then we also have options for dogs who are not friendly with other dogs. They don't socialize, but they do other forms of enrichment. And that was actually legit inspired by Tyler Muto in our visit with him. But anyways, like the point I'm trying to make is in order to get to that vision, I had to create that system, and I had to make sure we could teach the staff to feel competent enough and capable enough to get it done. And I just notice a lot of trainers, they don't take the time to write that system down, which is what we went over in episode 1. But yeah, I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, one analogy story analogy, well, either way, one analogy that I often use is from John Coltrane. So to me, dog training, when it's done really well, is very much an art. There's a lot of intuition that goes in. Like, it's not a paint by numbers thing. And for anybody that's maybe not familiar with John Coltrane, he played the saxophone. And if you listen to a lot of his later music, especially after he was with Miles Davis, his music was like very avant-garde, like very just expressive. Like, his being is coming through that instrument in a very just free-flowing kind of way, right? But what many people don't know is in the early stage of his career, and actually the reason that Miles Davis hired him to be part of his band initially when he was still like relatively unknown, was his reputation was being the most technically precise player. He used to drill himself on just the scales up and down, just being as technically precise with those core mechanical skills as you can possibly be. And so for me, when it came to grooming my own staff members, that was sort of the approach I wanted to take. So there are certain like fundamental things, right? Like how to hold a leash, the mechanical, like step by step, like you have to understand what are the learning mechanisms at play during e-collar conditioning. That's why if anybody takes my e-collar course online, it's broken up into specific steps that if you were to watch me collar condition a dog, you wouldn't see all those. You wouldn't see a clear line between all those steps. It would be a much more fluid process. It would be John Coltrane in his later years. But if somebody doesn't understand those technical things, like in this portion of learning, this is the mechanism that is at play. And here's how you recognize it. Here's what it looks like. Let's do it in isolation. Let's get technically good at that. Then what happens is, again, I've seen a lot of e-collar training programs for professionals where it's just like kind of taught in like one foul swoop. And then it works for 80% of dogs. Around the 20% that they struggle with, they have no ability to troubleshoot because they don't understand like where the sort of error came in. And so there are absolutely like, yes, there are, again, certain things that it's like, you need to understand this concept. And then again, we're going to practice it. Like we're going to do the skill acquisition portion of this. And they have to be very systematic. And then once you get really good at those systematic things, then you can be much more playful and free with how you actually approach this whole thing. And so that's my senior staff could be much more intuitive in their training and deviate off of that strict path. But somebody in the beginning, it's like, no, these are the very specific things. Like if you're a beginner, do it this way until it's good. And once you understand that, then you'll be able to deviate from it. You'll be able to read the dog a little bit better, but you have to have some guardrails. Like you have to have some of those like very strict guidelines. Like this is how you control the group of dogs. For us in daycare, it was like, okay, cool. Like you're new, you're out here with a bunch of dogs. Can you get this one dog into that corner without like physically moving them, without putting a leash on them and touching them? Can you do that? Okay, cool. Like, I'm going to show you how, like, I'm going to give you that skill set. Great. Now, can you do it with 2 dogs? You get 2 dogs in there at the same time, 3 dogs, 4 dogs, right? And we're teaching you how to move your body, so on and so forth. So we can tell you what it's going to look like first. We can tell you the skills that you're going to need. We can show you a picture of it or a video of it. And then comes the actual training portion where we're going to do it together I'm going to demonstrate some. I'm going to watch you do it. I'm going to give you feedback on what you're doing, tell you the things you're doing really well, tell you the things that we can try a little bit differently, have you practice those things. And that's how we're going to train you into that actual skill there. Yeah.
Well, and it's to your point, like what made me a better teacher of people is having different variety of people to teach, right? And so like even with dogs, there are some dogs super driven, super strong character. Like you can do shitty dog training on them and they'll still turn out pretty good, you know?
Of course, yeah.
And it was the dogs who it didn't work, the 20% it didn't work for, that made me a better dog trainer, you know? So with humans, it's like I could get a really smart employee, super competent, super conscientious. I can give them a really shitty system and they're going to do awesome. And I'm going to think I'm a really good boss. And every now and then I get an employee who they're just not clicking. Something's not getting, and it reminds me of something. I believe you said something along these lines, but I know for a fact Michael Ellis said it. He goes, when I started doing seminars, I had to learn to break stuff down that I didn't even think was important, like how to hold your food, like how to rotate your wrist to the side, or how to just lift it by 2 inches. Like you don't notice those things are important until you see someone who does not comprehend it and get it. And that's what leadership was for me.
Well, and again, it does require self-awareness too. That comes up a lot actually when I'm coaching trainers and they're struggling with, for instance, a client let's just like use a simple example, like a client not giving a leash correction properly, like not doing a good leash pop. And this could be you training another staff member to do the same thing. Like it doesn't really matter. It's the same. And so they'd be like, I don't understand why the client's not getting it. And a lot of times that trainer doesn't have enough of an awareness of the little details of what they are doing and how it differs from what the client's doing to know that like, oh, the reason it's not working is because they've got their wrist this way and not that way. And so it does require like knowing the actual technical details of what you're doing. Like for instance, that's why I think Cesar Millan is actually not that great of a teacher. I think he's phenomenal with dogs. I mean, he has a gift. I think he's really good at like interacting with people and like inspiring people and motivating them. But when it comes to the actual like getting somebody to a skill level, even anywhere near to him, he's awful. I mean, there's just not a good track record there. I mean, part of it's because what he does is a lot of talent, just like innate talent. But I think part of it's also like he doesn't even have a language to articulate some of the things that he does well. Like for instance, if you watch him, he's like actually uses negative reinforcement masterfully, but I don't think he could actually define negative reinforcement if you asked him to. You know what I mean? And so he doesn't understand fully, I think, why what he's doing is working the way it does. He just does it and it works. And then but there's not like, there's a lot of detail that's kind of missing there. And I haven't worked closely with Cesar, so like maybe I'm not being fair. I don't know, but that's just my well,
I'm sure he knows what those things, but maybe back when he was doing his show.
It's questionable. It's questionable. But regardless, I see it happen a lot with trainers that are trying to teach other people to train, right? So it's like they don't realize these little mechanical things, these little details of like, you know, so for instance, when I'm teaching somebody to do like the walk behind technique, and I do it mostly, like most of my teaching these days is remote, and somebody can come back like, hey, I watched your course and I'm struggling. And I'll be like, send me a video of what you're doing. And it's like, I know I can pinpoint exactly why they're struggling, like exactly why it's not working for them. And it's like, to an untrained eye, it looks like they're doing everything right, but there'll be like a little timing thing or the way they move their body a little bit differently. But if you don't understand your own process in that way, then it's really hard. And again, the beginning of that is broken record time, self-review and reflection. I think part of the reason I got really good at that was from doing so much video of myself and editing all that video and watching myself do these things over and over again. I became really, really good at spotting what it's supposed to look like and then seeing when it looks differently from that. I do the same thing with my day trading. Like we were talking during the break about my day trading, but like every single day I take screenshots of the best trade of the day. I want to ingrain that into my brain so that I'm just conditioned to know what it's supposed to look like what all those details are, so I can spot it in real time. But it's that idea of having that self-awareness to begin with. And then you know those little things like Michael was saying, like, oh, it's like they're not holding food the same way I am. Well, have you given thought to how you're holding food? Did you realize that you always hold it in a specific way? I see this also again with clients where the trainers go it's like a 4-week board and train, and the dog's going home, and they go to have the owner do place command, for instance, and all of a sudden the dog's failing. And they don't understand why, but they don't realize that every single time they told the dog place, they were standing with the right side of their body facing closer to the place command and holding the leash in their left hand with their left hand dropped at their side and their head turned a certain way. And they were always doing it that way and not realizing that now the client's doing it differently. And that's why the dog's not responding, because it's a picture they're not used to. But if you don't even realize those little things that you always do, you either A, can't anticipate and go, oh, I need to make sure I break this pattern so the dog's prepared for what its owner might do, or I need to coach the owner on these details because that's what the dog is trained specifically for. So yeah, knowing your own system. I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but just like as an exercise for yourself to actually have to write out an outline of like step by step, like it's harder if you've never done it. You could be an amazing dog trainer, but to actually have to write down step by step, that if I had to create like an online course of how to teach heel or how to teach place and write down the steps, you'd be blown away how hard it is, because there's so many things you do that you just don't even really regularly consider. So if you are tasked with having to teach other people, like it's tedious, but do it. And then the bonus is it's going to make you phenomenally better in your own training as well. Like not just in your ability to teach others, but like the self-awareness that you'll gain or the clarity that you'll gain through that process, like your own training of dogs is going to dramatically improve.
Yeah. And writing it down, having the plan, self-review, these principles, I think they're universal principles for any type of improvement. The other thing I want to talk to people about that I think sometimes gets in the way of teaching and or training, it's going to be so I learned this paradigm. They said that there's the pretty much there's two zones. I can be in the performance zone, which is like being on stage, performing in front of a crowd, or I can be in the rehearsal or practice zone, right? And a lot of times dog trainers and their employees they are having to learn in the performance zone. So like imagine being
terrible learning environment.
Yeah. Imagine being an actor who's learning how to act in front of a crowd of people, and you're not going to hit your marks. You're not going to know you're blocking. You might be good 10% of the time, versus being able
We used to make our trainers sorry to interrupt, but we used to make our trainers, for instance, before they would do a private lesson where they had to like introduce the e-collar to a dog, for instance. We would make them sit down and like I would pretend I was the client and they had to like go over everything of like, here's how you turn it on, here's how you charge it, here's how you fit it, like da-da-da. And we'd actually rehearse that. And it's so awkward feeling, just like, anything else. But we would do it over and over and over and over again so that in front of the client wasn't the first time. Like we were able to review, give them feedback, go over like, hey, you missed this, or I would say this part first before that part, whatever it is. But it was like, there are those things where we would say, okay, I'm the client, you got to teach me,
Yeah. And it's funny because we're dog trainers. We do this with dogs. Hopefully, if you're a good dog trainer, right, you control the levels of distraction, you control the levels of stress, and you build the skill, right? And so it's so funny because it's like as dog training entrepreneurs or leaders, we have the skill set. We know the breakdowns. We just don't take the time to slow it down and create these learning and intentional learning opportunities for our employees and our staff, right? And I think that in and of itself would make all the difference for a lot of people struggling with their staff and their time. Like booking a meeting. Once a month, we used to have what was called Trainers Night. And Trainers Night at my company was, or it still is, it's usually Thursday nights, because no one's doing stuff on Thursdays. And we would just buy a bunch of food. We'd have some beers and some wine, and we'd go over training concepts, and we'd train dogs for, 2-3 hours. And we'd go over, a new video that I think we actually went over the walking behind video in one of those trainer nights. Right. So but just being able to collab, some of this, hey, I'm having trouble with this dog. Okay, bring them out. And we all what do you guys think? What do you think? So now we're becoming a team, but we're making time to just kind of like a symposium. We're just having conversation with each other about what's going on. And that not only helps with comprehension, it really helps with camaraderie and teamwork and stuff like that, right? But yeah, I just wanted to say understand the rehearsal zone versus the performance zone. And if you find yourself as a dog entrepreneur, like if you're trying to train your team, but your team is constantly under pressure, and they are not performing the way you'd like them to perform, just see what happens if you budget out time with no pressure, where you can go slow, step by step, get super modular, and see what happens.
And an environment where you can fail safely, right? So like, kind of going back to Michael Ellis too, I remember there was, I think it was in one of his videos, maybe even like the power of playing with your dog or something like that, but where he was showing like to make sure you can lure a dog like in a straight line. He must have at some point realized like how much people were struggling to get that when they had their dog out. So he literally set up like a long line between two chairs, like 20 feet apart, and have them go back and forth, like, and they had to keep their hand along that line. So it was a straight line. So it was like, okay, the performance zone is like, you've got the dog. A lot of these people are sport competitors. They're not teaching others. They just have to learn how to do it with their dog. So he created an environment where it's like, if you get it wrong, you're not going to screw your dog up. Like, I'm like right now, my son does soccer, and the league that he's in, the spring league, is outdoors, and it's much more intense. They have practices, and they really like keep track of winners and losers and that kind of thing. The winter season, there's 2 winter sessions, and they're indoors, and it's smaller, and they don't even keep track of score or who's winning and who's losing. And so there are certain things that, like, my son has his strengths and his weaknesses, and one of his weaknesses right now is like when he gets the ball, he just wants to get rid of it. Like he's not confident to like keep it and try and dribble. So I was like, hey man, like this is the time, like this is where just go for it. Cause like if it gets stolen from you, like who cares? Like this is where it doesn't matter, and you can just practice and get comfortable with it. And I think that's like, yeah, that's such a crucial thing there is. And again, we talk about it in a variety of disciplines, but that the performance environment is not where you're not going to learn in the performance environment. It's a terrible, if you know anything about the science of learning and conditions that are ripe for learning to take place, like it's a horrible learning environment. But after the performance, right? Like doing that postmortem, doing that review, getting those practice sessions in, right? It's just like a sports team. Like there's a reason that they practice, they have scrimmages, and then also that they do reviewing the tape. Like that's where all the learning takes place. And then game time is where you execute and you see if like has my performance improved based on what's taking place in the learning environment. 100%. Yeah. And for things like teaching a private lesson, if you're like a solo person, for instance, and so it's like, oh, I don't really have anybody to practice on. But again, like I always say, like just recording your lesson and watching it back, that's getting another rep in. And you're getting that rep in where, I mean, if you're like me, when I'm doing a private lesson, my adrenaline's flowing, like my veins are sticking out. Like it's like I literally am performing. I feel like I'm on stage. And when I can watch it back after the fact, like I'm relaxed, my brain is receptive, my heart rate's slower, I'm not full of adrenaline, I'm like sipping a cup of tea or maybe some whiskey. It's an environment that is much more receptive to learning.
No, I love that. Yeah, it was funny when you were talking about it feels like performing, because I do a lot of mental noting. So like I've even when I was a songwriter, I wouldn't write anything down because I'd memorize it, right? I would take pictures in my mind of the movie that was playing in my head. But I do the same thing with like explaining dog training, right? So like I'll teach 3 or 4 group classes every single week. And what has kind of evolved me into becoming a better teacher was a self-reflection, but it's also a self-reflection of like edutainment. Like I kind of have like these comedy bits that I do sometimes with certain clients, and I'll see which ones are stinkers and which ones hit the mark and which ones, just fall flat. And so my head is filled with like hundreds of different ways of explaining the same stuff in an educational, I have a way to make someone feel happy, sad, motivated, like all these different ways on the same topic of dog training, But I just realized that's my form of self-reflection and journey is like, am I impacting the crowd? Am I impacting the students or the teachers? And I just take these mental notes of that material. But imagine what would happen if I wrote down stuff more. It'd probably be even better. That's cool. Mariano, anything you want to say about teaching, training?
Just a couple things and then we'll wrap up here. So, Tyler, in the last episode, we had talked about how important and how invaluable it was for you to make a curriculum for that Leerbird program. And that is a skill in itself that I think dog trainers don't value as a skill in itself, the ability to write a curriculum. I made myself a little note here. It's kind of joking that everybody remembers that episode of SpongeBob where he draws a perfect circle And it turned out as like this whole fancy drawing of like a sculpture, and then he erases some and then he erases more. And the point there being, people often, new trainers who don't have a curriculum and don't know how to build one, it's not just what they don't say or what they don't recognize as the critical piece that's missing. It's all the other not really critical pieces that they do think are missing, and they'll focus on things that don't matter instead of the ones that do. And so they talk more, even though they give, I wouldn't say less info, it's too much info. It's just not the one piece you had to give. And I think that Tyler has the ability or built the skill to make a curriculum. I think of Stephanie from Method K9 who makes curriculum. I think it's an entire skill in itself to be able to put pieces in an order and a sequence that make contiguous sense together, going from 1 to 2 to 3, not 3, 1, 2 type thing, right? So that was the final piece that I wanted to add to that. And beyond that, I just wanted to review. It's been a great episode, but a long one for people who are listening. Just to recap this, we started discussing the ins and outs of improving communication skills as a leader. We went over listening, intentional listening, observing, being mindful, being aware of how you come across, and the importance of crafting your point. What are you going to say when you respond? Don't react, respond thoughtfully. Then after that, we started discussing the importance of clear communication, making sure that your approach, making sure your timing, your tone, and of course that purpose we just talked about are all where you want them. Because if you're not thoughtful with these things, those footballs are going to land somewhere. You just want to make sure that you're aware of where and that you have sort of a hand on the wheel and you get to decide where. So you want to manage your tone, your approach, and your timing, right? And then we wrapped it up with riffing a bit on teaching and training and building competency, building knowledge, building efficiency, and all of the ins and outs therein. A learning environment versus a practice environment. When do you kind of test your mettle, and when do you take the pressure off of yourself so that you have the wherewithal, the freedom, the playful attitude to engage in new strategies and attempt new things, even if you fail, right? Thank you guys so much. This has been a great episode, and I think all of us would really love your guys' feedback on this episode and just what you think of season 4 so far. You guys, we constantly try to make sure that this podcast is about its listeners, and we're constantly trying new things. You guys giving us direction helps us figure out which new things to try. This has been episode 2 of the 3-part series with Tyler Muto. Thank you again, Tyler, for spending time with us. Were there any final words before we wrap up today?
I just want to say, just I sound like Nike here, but like, just do it. Like, especially when it comes to like the curriculum, like you're talking about, like it's a skill. Your first one's going to suck. It's okay. Like if you're newer to this, like it's not the outcome, it's the action. It's the process of doing it that the benefit's going to be. It's not what it actually looks like at the end necessarily. Just start, like just act. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love that. I want you guys, we have one more episode scheduled in this series that we're doing. The next one is going to be titled Lead Like a Leader. And the purpose of that episode is going to be talking about kind of the human connection aspect. What is it that makes people want to work hard for someone? What is it that we can do as leaders to help motivate our teams and create camaraderie and create, in essence, a love and of the same passion, to hit our goals as entrepreneurs and dog trainers. And that's going to be a really, really fun episode, and we're super excited for it. So love you guys. My name is Brent Labrada. That guy's Mariano Alvarez. Thank you again to Tyler Muto. We'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
We really hope that you enjoyed this episode and can't wait to be back with you guys. Be sure to follow us at Dog Trainers Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And don't forget to punch the hell out of that subscribe button and leave us a review.
Remember, guys, this is your podcast. You're the best listeners in the world, and we'll see you next time.